Hello, YouTube dwellers. Those who dare to enter my channel will be blessed with little bits of knowledge and horrific amounts of having to stare at foreheads. Another video. I want to make some more videos like this now that I have stuff set up to do it on the office PC, and I've had to wait for everybody to go home today. Um, but I want to talk about something that's to do with how I've been modeling teams recently, and specifically their coaching staff and how they succeed as a result of their game plan, more so than their players. I think now we're at a position in Overwatch where it seems the coaches are having more of an impact than the players themselves. Some people that came into the league with massive name value are performing far worse than others who didn't. A lot of players are performing very well when the team is performing well around them and poorly when they're not. And I think Overwatch has been tending this way for a long time, and people expected it to hit this eventually. I think we're now probably there, where it's more to do with how your team is operating and the role that you can play within the system rather than how good you are as a player. How good you are as a player. Yeah, that was the correct sentence. So it's much more, in my opinion, about. So let's take NYXL for example. Before I actually talk about the topic of the video, um, NYXL's players are very, very good. And if you were asked to say who the best players in the league are, I think you would be hard pressed to come up with other answers than NYXL. The reason for this is that although there are incredibly talented individual players on a lot of other teams, let's say Striker, you might put him over Sib Yorbi, you might put a guy like Fletter in, or maybe even QO over Libero or something like this. Um, you might want Gesture over Mano or I don't know. There really are only a couple of options, but I think my point still stands, right? There are individuals that you could make the argument that they fit into that system, or that they are better individually, or better on their team, or whatever. But more of what makes people good at Overwatch is fitting into a system that their coaches have given them. So the idea that Huck came into the league with for the Boston Uprising of finding coachable players, I think I think he's been proven true. I think it's a bit of a Moneyball situation with the Boston Uprising, where they had a weird system coming into the league and everyone scoffed at it. But I think their record proves itself. And yeah, they're in the trash can right now, but I think you would be very foolish to write it off. You know, his philosophy coming into the league that it's more about you being able to fit within a system. And so this is why I'm coming back to this is that it's really more of a strategical game right now, and being able to play the style of the team and be able to do your role is more important than being the flashiest player in the world or being able to clutch in certain scenarios or literally being better at other people at like aim or something like this is less important than working as a team. And that might sound very like a wet blanket, oh, you just have to work as a team. But it does actually seem like that at the moment in Overwatch. It's now become more important than stringing a load of good players together into a team. Anyway, the way that I've been modeling teams recently in terms of their strategy and their system is by thinking about it in terms of layers. So a lot of people I notice when they discuss how good a team plays will talk about different aspects of their teamwork or aspects of their strategy as if all are equal, as if you can just plug um, something into a team at any stage in its development. And I don't really agree with this. I think that teams are really built, as in built, like a tower. Like you build them in layers. You have to set a really good foundation, and then you can build on that with like a bit of style to your game plan. You can build on that with different compositions. You can build on that with different counter strategies and play styles. But at your core level, you really have to have the fundamentals. And if you don't have the fundamentals, it'll all topple above it. So it's like a tower of Overwatch strategy, right? Your base level has to be really good before you can implement the other stuff effectively. And I think this is important. And in some sense, you can use this model to describe any team currently in the league. So, what do I mean by the fundamentals? Obviously, there are different parts of fundamentals that all kind of come together to make this base layer of what makes a team so good. You got to have the players knowledgeable about what their roles are in whatever meta you're playing. This in some sense, was kind of more important in the previous meta because there was only really one. There wasn't really one, but there was a range of compositions on a similar theme, right? So you knew how your hero would always interact with the overall meta and the important bits. Like, at this point, I really have to be focused on X. So, if I'm a diva, at this point, I really have to be focused on peeling for my backline because I know that they're about to dive in for them. Or uh, yeah, I'm a Winston. I have to be very cognizant of making space for my DPS in this particular instance because they have a dragon blade they want to use or something like this. So you have to have players that are good at their role, and also players that know the important parts of their role, the win conditions or the mistakes that they have to avoid making to avoid losing. And then you need to be able to know the interactions between different heroes and their play styles. So your tank player needs to know how to communicate and sync up with your tracer in dive, for example, and you have to be able to factor in what the playstyle of the other people are on your team as well. Do I have a tracer that's very aggressive and likes to go for their backline? Are we going to be syncing up on a lot of two-man dives? Instead, does my tracer like to peel much more? Am I going to be have to be making kind of more solo flanks and working off my primal rage a little bit? Am I going to instead pair it with my diva or when we're going aggressive and leave my tracer to stay behind and try and peel off DPS? And factoring into this as well, you have to have an overall game plan. What I mean by an overall game plan is not that each player would have an overall game plan. These have all been player specific so far, right? The players have to know their role and have to know the important bits of how the role fits within the meta at the time, and the players have to know how to work with the other players on the team. These are just absolute base level foundations. The other thing that really ties them all together, and in some sense you could argue has to come even before that, is the overall game plan. And I know a lot of teams at the moment really seem to be lacking this from the little bits of insider info that I've got from talking to coaches, talking to GMs, talking to players, and then actually being able to observe the game myself. It seems like a lot of teams at the moment, particularly those who don't have head coaches in the current main positions or have lost them recently, seem to be lacking this overall plan. And this does not mean that your head coach has to be a genius who's laying down the micro of where everybody is supposed to go at every time. They it's really just incredibly important that everybody's on the same page. It doesn't even matter whether that's the best page in the world. I suppose the analogy kind of breaks down at that point. But it doesn't matter if the coach is the most gifted, talented wizard in the entire league, crusted wizard in the entire league. It's just more about whether all of your team are on the same page, I think. And once you once you stop people having playstyles that don't work well together, what one guy on your team let's use the Tracer and the Winston again, because that was the example I used earlier. Let's say your Tracer really wants to peel, but your Winston also your Winston wants to be really aggressive. Your Winston wants to be syncing up the dives with the Tracer, but the Tracer's more comfortable peeling and likes to do damage to tanks or something. Pardon? I've been drinking Diet Coke. Water's hard to come by in this arena. Okay, so yeah, so say you've got a disconnect there. A head coach's job in a lot of situations, a best thing you can do for a team, at least as soon as you enter, is fix those foundations by saying, okay, here's the way that we're going to play. And yeah, you might, if you're not the best head coach in the world, you might not fit everybody to their absolute optimal play style. The best coaches in the world will come in and they'll say, okay, we've got a Tracer who's incredibly good at doing this. We've got other tanks who are great at doing this. Got a backline that's great at doing this. What kind of system can I think up? What kind of game plan? What kind of play style, color of the team can I invent or copy from someone else or put together pieces to be able to make all of our pieces work as well as possible. But even if you're not that good, even if you just come in and say, this is the style that we're going to play, the very virtue of everybody being on the same page will create much better synergy and cohesion. And I feel there's a lot of teams, I'm going to go through some examples later, of teams that don't play as if they've got somebody like that behind them. They play just like everyone's trying to make the best out of what they think. It's very much player centric, it seems, when I'm watching the games where, they have some idea of how their role works, but somebody else that a really important hero that they need to be working with has a different idea of what they need from them. And so this, I think, is all very basic. You need a guy with a game plan, whether that's like your player shot caller or whether that's a coach. It doesn't matter as much. Obviously, it's better if you have the coaching staff decide that kind of thing. And then you need to have all the fundamentals of like how you interact with each person and what their play style is, and honing that synergy together. And there's a lot of teams that still fail to do that, honestly, and are kind of carried more by their individual skill, even at the Overwatch League level. And then you can start to build on that foundation with developments like learning different compositions, learning different set strategies. Also, obviously, another foundational element is just learning set positions for every hold. Say you have a set position on Blizzard World. There's a map that came to mind. Or Horizon or something like this, and you want to run an Orisa defense. Where does everybody hold? Where does everyone hold? Where are they rotating to? What's important in the rotation? What kind of stuff do you need to watch out for when you're rotating? What would signal a rotation? what would cause that rotation to halt or alter in some sense. These are also incredibly foundational skills. But when different compositions are involved, like for example, the example I was using there is like an Orisa comp, that's slightly higher level in terms of my layers, right? At your base level layer, you're playing whatever the meta is, whatever you feel like your team gets to grips with first or the easiest or whatever fits them, which is what dive would have been in your previous the previous meta, or playing something like Widowmaker Tracer dive instead, like a counter dive kind of style. Okay, so you nailed that, but you then need to know where all the set positions are and where you're going to rotate and all of this stuff. Again, very foundational. This stuff is the absolute basics, and without it, I don't think you can reach the higher levels that you need to be able to take upsets off these top teams. So once you've got that foundation, you're then able to build on it with stuff like different compositions. So particularly in this meta, I really feel like it's punishing for some teams that haven't worked on fundamentals of their team play and stuff, where you need to be able to play at minimum three or four different, fairly different compositions. And some teams can get away with only playing a few. Dallas Fuel are really trying to push it with only a couple, maybe two or three major compositions that they play. Um, Whereas other teams like LA Valiant, for example, will play a huge range of compositions, as will NYXL when pushed. But you can only learn to develop those different compositions once you have some base level foundations covered. It's very difficult, I think, for teams to be able to incorporate counter strategies for other teams and running a huge array of different compositions where they're flexible. If they haven't nailed down the fundamentals of that comp, they'll just look awful. If you're approaching a situation and you know that the counter to whatever they're running is double sniper, for example, but your team has not practiced the fundamentals of double sniper, you are just going to feed with that comp, I think. And so it can be worse for you to pick the composition that is right for that situation because it's not right for your team. And that's because you haven't set the foundational layer. So you can't apply the counter strategy to the other team without the foundations being there. And in some sense, you can't even learn the foundations of a completely different composition unless you've got the foundations of knowing what playstyles people have in your team, knowing what heroes they're familiar with, knowing how you interact with their with their hero styles and stuff like this. If you are not comfortable with knowing when Prophet or Birdring are going aggressive, then this is going to be a fundamental that trips you up no matter what range of compositions you play. It's not going to really matter what heroes they're on and this kind of stuff. In general, if they are going to go aggressive at a certain time and you're unaware of it, you intuitively don't sense it, you're probably going to fuck that up no matter what composition you're playing. So this is why I say the fundamentals, any holes in your fundamentals are really going to show and going to make the tower very unsteady, and they're going to topple once you start adding more and more pieces. Once your strategy gets more and more complex, the foundations actually become more and more important. Stuff like positioning is massive as well. The team in the league that's the best at positioning is by a country motherfucking mile, NYXL. Is this some kind of advanced, incredible, deep strategy? It might be because they've actually honed it to that sense. But positioning in and of itself, being able to escort players into better and better positioning, to slowly squeeze out targets with better poke because you have people running better sightlines, this is not some kind of advanced counter strat where it's not something they run from a fucking NFL playbook where all of the pieces they're like execute Project Alpha and they all just boom burst out. This is them honing the fundamentals to such a degree where it looks just beautiful. Every piece is working perfectly. They know how everyone's going to play. They can rotate everything. In some sense, they are just the masters of that, and that's what's gotten them to such a level. So where does that leave a lot of the teams in terms of where they're at in this tower? If we call it the Tower of Overwatch strategy, where are they? Well, obviously Florida and Shanghai are miles at the fucking bottom, and in some senses have started digging backwards. They're like trying to dig foundations, so they're actually going further down at sometimes. And if you think about Shanghai throughout the entire league, this should be obvious because they have been set back so many times and suffer such a fundamental problem with their communication, where they are trying to communicate in three different languages, of which only one player on their team altering can speak all three. Well, no fucking wonder they can't get their fundamentals down. No wonder they can't develop any kind of strategy on top of it. No wonder they can't develop any kind of different compositions to run, and they were only trying to hold and dive for the entire time they were together because there are so many holes in their fundamentals that they just couldn't get back on top of it. And part of the reason for this is because it takes time. It takes time to be able to build these things and go through every map and hone how you work with other people and what your positioning should be. And if instead you focus on the high level of the tower and you're thinking, okay, we're prepping for X team, we now really need to focus on these guys because we need X and X win. You know, okay, we're going up against Florida Mayhem this week. This is how they play. Let's try and counter strike that. Well, you're leaving out the whole fucking bottom of the tower, which is still going to just not fall over and you're shit out of luck again, which I think you'll agree we've seen Shanghai do many times. Ever since they came into the league in the middle of the season with the revamped Korean roster, they seemed like they were more focused on each individual win rather than making long-term gains for their team. Now, yes, they did do some of that because they were trying to learn dive and they did actually improve some level of their fundamentals. Their setup for team fights was better. The positioning that they got and the space they were able to create before they initiated was better than what the full Chinese team were doing early on in the league. There is no doubt about it. But still, they did not. They haven't really seemed to improve that in the last 2 months, and whiffed an opportunity for the new meta being an opportunity for uh, a lot of people's towers at that point. A lot of the real top level strategy becomes unusable. The top of the tower, you can't visit it anymore because the fundamentals have changed. The fundamentals of how different compositions interact with each other, the different positioning that you need to take, who's playing different heroes and how they interact. Because this bottom level of the tower needed restructuring, the top level of the tower was inaccessible for a while. So if you can catch up as the Shanghai Dragons to this level, you're in some sense on an even playing field because the top level of the tower isn't exactly the same. That's where it becomes way more variable. Bottom level, the actual foundations, very much transferable from meta to meta. Again, which is why NYXL are so bloody good in every single meta. So Florida are also in a similar situation. They are so far behind in terms of their fundamentals, in terms of knowing the win conditions and how each hero is supposed to interact in the dive meta. They were so far behind that they were never able to catch up, even with some pretty decent individual talent on the Florida Mayhem. Guys like Logix, who we've seen have insane performances previous times, legitimately at some time was like a very, very good player. Tvik, who hasn't been the greatest player for a long time, but there are occasionally flashes of it. This team could have still done better than it was had it had an overall game plan that suited it well. Somebody to come in and actually teach them, all right, here's where you're supposed to be rotating at different times. Here's where you're supposed to be getting the best out of your positioning. And here's how the different heroes interact. And we really saw that they only began to improve at the dive meta when Ryder was added to the team along with Sire Player and Awesome Guy, who as a trio, I believe, tried to teach them how to play the the meta style of dive, which was much more about syncing up your Tracer with your Winston and getting those key picks on targets, and then being able to disengage and keeping your backline alive where the Widowmaker was, etc. The kind of stuff that had been around since Apex Season 4, but these guys just hadn't quite grasped it. And because their fundamentals weren't there, because they fundamentally didn't understand what the I guess it sounds weird to say the win condition was, but just the best way of playing it. So I guess they didn't really understand what the meta was. They were running the correct heroes, but they weren't running them in the correct, I say correct, weren't running them in what most people would say is the optimal way to run them. Previous meta before Brigitte was added. And because they were so far behind, because they realized this so late, you can't possibly catch up to the rest of those teams. You don't have time to be able to develop your fundamentals to that level. Now, another great team to use as an example here is Dallas, because Dallas were, again, like Florida, so far behind in their understanding and even fundamental fucking ability to play the heroes that they were never going to catch up. And they went the opposite way to Florida and Shanghai, and they decided, well, fuck it then, we're not going to learn dive. Oh, my bad. Sorry. These bloody sodas. Huh, I need to drink water. So they were like, okay, we're so far behind. We're not even going to bother to run dive. We're just going to try and run tanky compositions, some cheese comps in certain situations. That Orisa triple tank attack on Anubis, for example, Anubis A. I mean, this stuff is not meta by any means, but they had already tried meta and they'd failed because their fundamentals were so poor and because they literally couldn't play the heroes in some situations. Uh, Other parts of fundamentals as well, which I've failed to acknowledge, will be stuff like your calling structure and this kind of thing. But I'm not going to give input on calling structure because I've never been a coach and I've never worked directly with a team, and so it's not my area of expertise. But again, there's a lot of stuff that you can lump into here that just form the absolute core foundation. So Dallas is such a great example because they do now understand their roles. Whereas previously the holes in their fundamentals were couldn't play the heroes and didn't understand what those heroes were supposed to do to make them so good, or how to get the most out of them, or how they interacted with the rest of the composition. This kind of stuff, particularly when we think of dive. Well, now they're playing tanks. They've always known, or at least the core of the team has always known how to play tanky compositions, how to make the most out of a Reinhardt comp, how to get the most out of tank abilities, which are much more about CC and chaining CC and being able to control uh, literal space between your front line and your back line and put pressure on the enemy team in a much more direct way. They understand these kind of things, the fundamentals that they knew back in 2016 and now carrying forwards now. This is the power of learning fundamentals. But you can see how they're not always transmutable properties. For instance, also calling structures, not always transmutable. Transmutable? Am I even using that word properly? I'm gonna look it up. I don't think I am. I think yes, to change from one form, nature, substance, state into another. Yeah, kind of. I'm using it in a bit of a metaphorical context, I guess. Um, yeah, so you can't necessarily use the same calling structure you would in dive through to a tank meta right now. I think some teams are beginning to realize that that's potentially an issue with their fundamentals as well. And Dallas now understand their roles. They can play the heroes. They understand the interaction between the heroes' abilities. They know the play styles of their team. They know the play style of Mickey when he's going to be playing Brigitte. He's aggressive. They're playing around him. They have an overall game plan now that Arrow's in, and he can really try and set some structure down. And now they're at the point where they can start building counter strategy with Peak and what's the other guy's name? Violet and Peak. So Dallas have in some sense fixed some of their fundamentals. They definitely have, but the meta has shored up holes, just kind of filled in holes or made the holes not as important. And you look at the opposite side of the coin, Boston, they don't understand what the fuck they're doing right now. They're starting to get the grips with it. They're starting, but they're players with a lot of inexperience who've just lost their head coach. They don't have the same kind of overall game plan that Krusty was applying them with. They don't know the kind of, they don't have the greatest knowledge of what their role should be when they play tanks because they haven't played tanks in ages. They certainly haven't played tanks at this kind of high level, and it's so different from what their structure was when they played dive. So Boston are in the opposite situation to Dallas, where the meta's changed, and now the fundamentals that they had learnt for dive, some of them are not applicable anymore, and they need to relearn the fundamentals. So this isn't a situation where you can just say, okay, Boston, you just play this composition, just go and play it. Like, this is the counter to this comp. They don't have the ability to understand what their role is. You see mistakes overextending on Brigitte fairly often. You would see players not backing up Gamsu in the same kind of way. Who else was Note, I think, was somebody that there was a big difference. I feel he was a guy that made very few mistakes and did his role incredibly well when it came to the dive meta. Had a great understanding of when to save his defense matrix, what the threats would be coming in, where he needed to rotate. Now he looks a little lost, and at least certainly early on in the stage, seemed to be at a bit of a loss for what to do in some of these team fights. And I could see kind of the cogs whirring in his head of like, I would know exactly what the fuck to do right now if they were running dive and we were running dive because I know all the win conditions and the mistakes that may possibly be made, and so my mind can process them all, think about what the best strategy would be. But when it comes to tanks, the game plays in such a different way that I feel a lot of the players on that team are thrown off. Now, the San Francisco Shock, to follow on from Boston, have just received that coach. They've just got a new head coach, Krusty, and he is making great use of them. So, Shock already had the ability to play all the heroes, the player knowledge of how those worked, a good understanding what everyone's playstyle works. They've been playing with each other for 3 months. 3 months? Something like that. So they knew this is how Sleepy plays, this is how Moth plays, even though he's a fairly recent addition. They know how Super and Sinatra play. And Krusty's come in and he's given them an overall game plan. He's given them a strategy to follow. He's kind of micromanaged Super and Sinatra and Choyobin a little bit more so that they've got a bit more synergy. He's given them plans to follow on each attack, I feel. So this kind of stuff has really helped push their tower up to the next level. Yeah, previously, they were just kind of grappling here and they couldn't didn't quite push forward. But the recent addition of the new head coach Krusty really seems to have stepped up their level because they didn't really have any fundamental flaws. Though it wasn't like the San Francisco Shock were appalling at a certain composition or didn't understand how to play something. They were just a fairly average team at a lot of stuff that was never able to really get the wins. If there was one fundamental problem that they had, it was a mental problem. It was choking, some kind of calling when they got into time bank situations, something like this, and that is something that you can work on afterwards. It's less. It's more like someone in a higher up tower was like accidentally took a drill out halfway through and started drilling down into your fundamentals rather than there being a hole there already. It's like self sabotage. You just need to fucking find out who's got the drill and kick them out the building. Again, though, San Francisco Shock, recent addition of a head coach, they've got a great game plan. When you watch London play, they really look like they lack a game plan. They've got their fundamentals in terms of they can all play the heroes they need. They know what their interactions between people are, or at least they should do, in terms of their play styles as well. But adapting to this new meta, they have struggled a little bit in having a new overall game plan. People are on different pages. They know that someone needs to go aggressive at this time in order to make space. They know that this is a threat, we need to go and deal with him, but different people are off doing different things. If you remember Reinforce's annotation, what's it called, Telestrator, that was hilarious to watch. This was kind of the what he was demonstrating as well, is that London very uncoordinated right now, and I think that this would be fixed by having an overall game plan. This is, again, one of the fundamentals that a head coach can come in and say, this is the style that we're playing. In this situation, you need to be reacting to this first, or in this situation, you need to be going forwards aggressively. Jester, when you use your Primal Rage, you need to be going aggressive rather than coming back to peel. That's Fury's job to be that defensive. Or, the other way around. Whatever it may be, whatever the strategy is, they need an overall strategy from a head coach, I think. And I've been saying this for a while, that I think the problem with London is that they lack this head coach. Even if they're not the best in the world, they were still having better results under Bishop. Just by the empirical evidence, that is what was happening. And I don't think that was because Bishop was some kind of god wizard king. I think it was because they were all on the same page. Now, whether that was because they were focusing on certain people or whether he had a certain plan for different players, this again is coaching. And once you get to that point, now you can complain about them running dive into Brigitte. Now you can complain about them not running the perfect strategy for perfect maps and having their positioning all right. But at the moment, they just haven't fixed their fundamentals. They don't have everybody on the same page. So if everyone's not on the same page, it doesn't matter what the fuck you run. It doesn't matter what strategy you're running or what counter comp you're running against the other team or what maps you're playing and how your rotations are or how good individual players are playing. It's about the fundamentals, and they've got most of them down, but they need everyone on the same page. They need a plan going into these games. Now, another cool one to talk about, and I'm literally going to go through every team in the league here and model where they're at in terms of their tower. And this is why I think it works well as a model, is that you can plug any team into this. Seoul, I think, have had an issue where they had a major piece that needed changing, i.e. their main tank position. And this major piece needed changing because they had lost the understanding of their role. Okay, so again, this is coming back to, for example, what I was talking about with Dallas or Boston, Boston now and Dallas previously, or even Florida, for example. The main tanks for Florida and for Dallas, when we're talking about Swoosh and we're talking about guys like Coco, didn't understand what their role was in this new meta. They didn't understand the purpose of Winston or how best to play him or who they should be syncing up with in the new meta. And I feel like that was the issue with Miro for a while. He had a very dated playstyle that wasn't the best way to play Winston at that point in time, and Seoul had to make a change. But by making a change, they need to go back to the fundamentals again. If you make a major change in your team, you are going to have to revisit a lot of these fundamentals. Why? Because Kuki or Ryu Jehong or whoever the fuck they have playing main tank needs to, in Ryu Jehong's case, learn how to play main tank. They need knowledge of their role. They need to know what's important for them to look out for at certain points. They need to be able to learn other people's hero playstyles so that they can sync up with them. How do I best sync up with Munchkin? How do I best sync up with Flether? How do I make best use of Zumba's protective capabilities when I'm getting out of these situations? How best do I get use of out of my primal rage to set my team up? These kind of things. Less so for Cookie, obviously. He has different things to work on. And for Soul, stuff like being having this overall game plan now completely changes because you've taken out somebody like Miro, who you were forced to work around because he had a set play style. You're now trying to plug Jaehong in, and you're thinking, okay, now we can tell Jaehong or Kuki theoretically, but this is why they were starting with Jaehong, in my opinion, is that we can now tell Jaehong to play any style. He is starting at base level 0 at square one. So whatever style we would theoretically love to have out of a Winston in this team with all the rest of our playstyles, we can tell Jaehong to play like that and we can try and coach him to do that thing. And so that requires you to revisit your fundamentals all over again and think, okay, how is this team structured? How would we like it to be structured? Who should be playing a more pivotal role in the team? Should we rebuild around Fleta, for example? Should our Winston actually just be trying to buy space by playing incredibly aggressive in the front line? Should our Winston be playing very flanky and trying to bait in? Are we trying to bait our backline because we know we trust in them to survive longer? These kind of questions need to be asked when you change a major piece, like, for example, your main tank in a team like Seoul who is struggling. It was a necessary change, but it does mean that you start back again at the basics. And so because Seoul had to start again at the basics when they had Jaehong in, and then they had to start again at the basics when they had Cookie in, and then they have to start again at the basics every time they want to make other weird subs, this is why we've seen teams like Seoul try and focus on one set roster. This is why when Boston came into the league, they focused on one set roster. Because when you change players in and out, you have to spend so much more time revisiting these fundamentals. You can't get onto the higher levels of the strategy tower. And this, I think, is why Seoul have taken so long to actually fix their team, is because whether it's a result of the coaches all having different ideas of how the team should play, or whether it's a result of focusing on higher levels of the tower first, like for example, we think that a more aggressive playstyle will go better against London Spitfire, so let's play X, X, and X. And it's like, cool, in theory that works, but they don't have the fundamentals. They have not played together long enough. They haven't been really working on their individual synergies. They don't have great idea of where to rotate and how to back each other up. Perhaps their calling structure isn't there or whatever. So I can see this very obviously with Seoul, is that their development as a team, I think, has been stunted massively by not focusing on the bottom layers, the absolute core basics, and making those excellent. If those are made excellent first, they'll be good. Now, one of the weird teams here are the Houston Outlaws, because I really feel like Houston Outlaws occasionally cycle through it. Houston are one of those teams that have a decent fundamental strategy and good teamwork, and they have all of this stuff together, but then they get to the top of the tower and where they're actually trying to apply counter strategy, and something just fucks them at the bottom. And so whether this was their lack of a good tracer player, which did come back to haunt them later on, even after they'd had success with it. You know, they start out stage 2 and stage 3, I think, by beating London Spitfire, just running kind of dive compositions, if memory serves, with Jake on the tracer most of the time. He was actually doing pretty well. They got good results out of it. They had a system that Jake could fit into. And so they feel like their fundamentals are kind of in some sense fixed. So they move on and they're trying to add new compositions in, add new counter strategies, work on more complex stuff. But actually, their core fundamentals of how they implement Jake into the team ends up being figured out. People shut down Jake, and then you're fucked because you don't actually have a default dive that you can go back to because people are just abusing the fact that you don't have a competent individual level tracer on your team. So and so for Houston, this kept cycling. I feel it was almost every stage they were, and for in the middle of stage 2, I think it was, they really got beaten up badly by a mentality problem. I think, or focusing on the wrong things. I remember watching their, what's it called? I don't know, but it's whatever Optic or Outlaws produces, and it's like their behind the scenes footage, right? The same as Inside the Valiant, but for Outlaws. And they're talking about how they're so focused on strategical elements that they just haven't worked on the basics. And this, I think, is obvious to a lesser extent when you see them play, because their actual teamwork and their synergies between each other, their understanding of playstyles, is actually fairly decent a lot of the time. But they tend to skip ahead a little too fast. They're trying to implement a lot of different compositions. They're trying to implement a lot of different playstyles and tweaks to their game that might catch opponents off guard. But it ends up fucking them over in the long run, especially when they get later on in a stage, because other teams just figure out how they play, and then they don't really have the core gameplay to be able to alter it massively. They can't pivot on a really strong base over to something else because the bottom of their tower is just all got looks like Swiss cheese. And in some sense, that's the same situation as Dallas, where they don't have the ability to play every composition, because they didn't really have somebody they put on dedicated Genji or Tracer duty. Um, so Houston Outlaws, I think, may run into the same problem this stage, where they start strong, and because they're keeping pace or outpacing other teams, they feel like they've got a good grasp on the meta and how to play it and how different pieces are interacting and that everyone can play every role. And then they start trying to counter comp other teams, or they get counter comp themselves and they realize, fuck, in order to beat, for example, an Orisa defense on Hanamura, we now have to learn how to play either a like the goat comp or some Rhine Diva composition like Dallas were playing, um, or we have to learn how to play dive. And for all of those different compositions, we have to start back at the fundamentals because they're so different from what we normally play. Um, and the time it takes to do that ends up ruining a lot of the rest of their compositions to the points where they don't even get wins in the end. They just have a lot of close losses because they can focus on either one or the other, fixing the fundamentals of different things or working on a lot of counter strategy, or really honing that one thing that they're really good at. Um, so the two LA teams are pretty well-rounded teams, honestly, or at least have been or became halfway through the season pretty well-rounded teams. Valiant are not the most flashy team in the world. I think this is pretty obvious. A lot of the people think that they're one of the most boring teams in the league, in fact. But their fundamentals, honestly, are there, and they are able to play a lot of different compositions as a result of it. They know for starters, they have a good idea of the hero pools of their team and how to utilize them. They have a good calling structure. They've got Fate and Custer there to be able to lead the team and call out what needs to be counter-strategized at what times. They seem to have put enough work into each composition and the rotations and the positioning, and they have the individual skill to lay a solid foundation for each of these. So they're not trying to go mad and counter-strat you with really complex playbooks like an NFL kind of thing where you're like, holy shit, where did that strat come from? But they are able to play a lot of different compositions to a very good degree, and that consistency across the board has carried them into a second place spot at the moment, along with various X Factor performances from a couple of their players. Gladiators are fairly well rounded as well, but I think their strength is that they just have a really good idea of what their style, what their overall game plan is. Again, I don't know whether this really came from the coach or whether this came from Fissure or kind of the coach identifying Fissure's strengths or Fissure working with the coaching staff. But certainly when Fissure came in, it seemed obvious. We are going to play around this guy. He is going to be our pivotal force and we're going to craft a team around him. Fucking great. That's a great overall play style. That's something the Valiant don't seem to really have. They don't have like a as much of an identity in that kind of way. You can't point to them and go, this is how the Valiant play, but they're so consistent across the board because they've got fundamentals of each composition that I think that in some sense is what the coaching staff have worked on. That is their game plan, to be consistent on a lot of different compositions and just play the meta way. They're not going to throw anything weird at you. They're just playing the meta, but they're doing it well across the board. Whereas gladiators play their own style, they have their own color, their own game plan, but they play it very well, and they can counter strat you because they have those fundamentals down. They've spent a long time, I think, working on the fundamentals of dive and then the fundamentals of these more tanky compositions, and got to a point where they were playing them really well. And it was only recently, I want to say within the last month or so, probably not the most recent Battle of LA, but the one in Stage 3, where we really saw counter strategies come out, and then a game later on in the season, I can't exactly remember who it was against. Maybe it was NYXL, where they had, London Spitfire, obviously. Yeah, so these big games where they play against London, where they play against LA Valiant, they have enough of a fundamental. They don't have any major flaws. They don't have flaws in how their play styles work. They don't really have flaws in how the individual synergies work. They're pretty well coordinated, so they can build counter strategy on top of that. They can throw something weird at you, and they've had enough time to practice it because they haven't had to work on, let's figure out the rotations on Gibraltar for the 20th time because you guys are still fucking them up. Of course, the most obvious one that I've repeated it again and again is NYXL. Their foundation's just so solid that pretty much the entire tower is just fucking foundation, isn't it? They're so ahead of others, and I think they'll continue to climb because their foundations are so good. Because they're not going to get ruffled by any meta change. They can continue to add wrinkles, not just to their counter strategy, but to different play styles. They've already got a great understanding of how to play this slow positioning based style. So now you're going to dive aggressively into them. Okay, so now we've learned how to play a slow style that counters really aggressive teams. They did that at the beginning of stage one. Other teams try and slow it down against them. They know how to play against that. Other teams are running weird cheese compositions. They learn how to play against that. All of the time because they don't really need to keep revisiting these bottom layers because they've got them down. They really perfected the bottom layers, so they don't need to spend time working on positioning again of like your very basics or like teaching somebody how to play a certain hero. They know how to play it all at a basic level, so they can add these extras on top. And that's what makes them so bloody fantastic at the moment. And I think Philadelphia are the weirdest team. I may have said the Houston Outlaws are very odd in that they cycle around constantly. They get a bit of counter strategy, but then their foundations end up kind of falling out from underneath them. But Philadelphia, I think, kind of skip bits, but get away with it because they're so individually talented. I think when you look at Philadelphia play, it doesn't look like they have they don't play the most. Uh, they don't play them with the most basic excellent Overwatch. You wouldn't watch Philadelphia to learn the best way of playing Overwatch. Their default positioning is decent. Their positioning, their rotations and stuff are decent, but occasionally and fairly often compared to a lot of teams, they're caught in weird scenarios. They have to skill their way out of certain scenarios. They are trying to outplay their opponents just head to head. They're going for weird, crazy plays that end up working, and they're very clutch. Um, they do have fundamentals in quite a lot of places. They have little solo synergies or duo synergies that work very well together, but they are pretty inconsistent in how they take team fights, and how many mistakes they make. It seems like they skipped bits of learning their fundamentals. I don't really know what it is. Is it the calling structure? Is it just how they're thinking about fights where they are trying to take advantage of much smaller opportunities than other teams? So they end up fucking it up because they haven't practiced that specific situation many, many times. Are they less risk averse than other teams? Are they just more content in the fact that they can outskill people? So they go for even fights and put themselves in worse uh, physical geographical positions in order to take advantage because they think they can just muscle it out. I'm not 100% sure, but definitely when you look at Philadelphia, they don't look like they have their foundation 100% there. And what was most impressive to me was when we saw them in the Stage 2 finals, because it really looked like they were playing very good Overwatch, and then they were also adding a bit of counter strat in there, specifically against the London Spitfire. I feel like we saw this a lot, where they were playing Fraggy and Snillo. They had like great duo synergy, all their fundamentals are excellent, and then they're throwing in some curveballs every now and then. Can't say in stage 3 and stage 4. Stage 3 and stage 4, at least the latter half of stage 3 and stage 4, that I've really seen that many curveballs come out from Philadelphia. They seem to be trying to outplay their opponents rather than play the best that they can. They're playing very much to counter their opposition and outskill them than they are to improve their own gameplay. That concerns me a little bit because Philadelphia, in terms of their skill, have one of the highest ceilings in the league, I think. And so to not follow this model of building up in layers concerns me that they will end up missing out on playoffs or something as a result of it, which would be a shame, I think, because I think if you really honed this team, they could be fantastic. Now, again, with everything I've said, I've never worked with a team before in a coaching role, and I'm sure that the way that the coaches model teams or something like that may be very different. But it does seem to me that from the outside looking in, that this idea of really having to build on the fundamentals before you can add the top parts in, and in some sense spending time trying to build little roof twizzles and crenulations ends up detracting from the time that you're spending building their foundations and ends up being counterproductive. So yeah, I've been thinking about this a little bit more. How one fundamental issue in Overwatch, or with one fundamental with the team, can fuck you over completely, and you have to rebuild right at ground zero all over again.